Many Christians read the conclusions to the Acts chapter 15 Jerusalem conference and conclude that there's only 4 commandments for Gentiles to obey under the new covenant. And simply because verses 19 and 20 here, the Apostle James declared, in conclusion to their debates here, "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those among the Gentiles who are turning." Key word there is turning. That's like in Hebrew we'll say teshuvah. If you're a Jewish person or an Israelite, you're returning. But teshuvah can also mean repentance, especially if you're a Gentile. You're not returning to Torah, you are converting. So you're turning. These are new converts. Key word here, turning to God, the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Verse 20, "But that we write to them to abstain from things polluted to idols, from sexual immorality, from things that are strangled," right? "And from blood." Wait a second. Now, 3 of these 4, that's 75%, are Torah dietary food laws. Well, wait a second. If everything is made clean here, did the apostles forget about that? If everything was? Well, anyway, how about murder? Murder's not one of those 4. Can Gentiles start murdering? Or how about lying, bearing false witness against their neighbors, and stealing and coveting? And, well, obviously, all 10 commandments, or the whole Torah, the written one, was not up for debate in Acts chapter 15. I think we can logically conclude that, but because people don't want to observe the Sabbath, they'll just say, well, that's not mentioned in the 4, and therefore I don't have to do it because I'm a Gentile. Well, that's bad reasoning, bad logic, as we could say, because like I said, you could use that same logic with murder or many other commandments in the Torah. But rather, we should continue to verse 21 here, as he says these 4 commandments, that are things that are polluted to idols, sexual immorality, things that are strangled in blood. He says, "For Moses," that's Moshe, "has throughout many generations those who preach him in every city that there are Jewish people and they're meeting on the Sabbath, being read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." Now, it's good to do it on the other days too, but here we see the implication is that the Gentiles are going to learn the rest of it. You don't just bombard them with all 613 or all of them. You don't just bombard any new convert with every single thing they're doing wrong, but start with some of these big ones that they are doing wrong, that they're arguing about or debating or having difficulty or thinking that it's okay to continue doing. Whatever the complaints and the debates come about, well, that's what you have to deal with. And this is what we see the Acts 15 Jerusalem conference is about. There's 5 commandments that are addressed in this chapter. Interesting number. That are being challenged, that are being complained about, that stimulate this conference, that brings Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem. Now notice 4 of these, again, are the starting points for conversion, but they are all in the written Torah. But one of these commandments is an oral versus a written Torah issue or commandment. For example, when you read the books of Moses, it was okay. Gentiles weren't, or I should say strangers, sojourners, and non-native borns were not forced into conversion. They could be allies. They could feast. They couldn't eat of the Passover lamb, but they could feast and keep the other feasts, and especially Sukkot and other feasts. We see them keeping it together The whole issue that you couldn't eat with a Gentile was a fence around the law. That was an oral law that became too strict. And also forcing circumcision right off the bat, especially when there's no circumcision of the heart. You know, when we read the Torah, the written Torah, circumcision of the heart is required, and we see that happening first before anybody was physically circumcised, unless they were a baby, of course. Babies aren't conscious enough, and that's an obvious issue. Baby boys, not girls, okay? So, anyway, some religions out there will do females, which is gross, and mutilation, and even with boys there's mutilation, so I'm not, supporting mutilation at all. And it was never done by the faithful ones, the faithful leaders of his holy people. Anyway, moving on here, regarding the weekly Sabbaths, obviously, which go all the way back to the beginning, as further proof that they were not up for debate or even challenged in Acts chapter 15. We can just go back 2 chapters. Go back to chapter 13, start in verse 42. It says here, just 42 through 44, it says, "So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged." They begged Paul. What does it say? They begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Well, why didn't they say, hey, come back to us on Sunday? It's the day of the resurrection, and come back tomorrow. They didn't say that here. Read it. They were observing the Sabbath. They said, come back next Sabbath. Verse 43, notice this. "Now when the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace." Here we have that word grace of the Most High. So grace doesn't abolish Sabbath here. Notice in verse 44, on the next Sabbath, what happens here? Almost the whole city came together. Jews and Gentiles came together to hear the word of the Most High. No complaints on which day was the Sabbath. It was not debated in the book of Acts during even the times that were written here. If there was, obviously there would be some arguments and some written complaints and debates. We'd have much evidence. The fact that it's not mentioned is an obvious given, just like murder. Nobody was saying, hey, is it okay if I can murder now because I'm a Gentile? No, if nobody's challenging or complaining about it, it wasn't an issue of writing about. They were writing about the issues that were having troubles and difficulties in that chapter, which stimulated the conference. So Gentile converts were already observing the 7th day, the weekly Sabbath, the Shabbat, without complaining, without debates. Like I said, otherwise we would see plenty of scriptural evidence of debate in Acts chapter 15 and onward in the Brit Hadashah writings. That's the New Testament.